we will be consulting on chapter 14. Okay, so we'll start with chapter 14. Now, I should say that this time around we have three chapters that take place in completely different parts of the story. And I think this is the first time where this has happened, other than the first class where we did the first two chapters, which also both take place in two different parts. So we're going to jump settings every chapter. So, first chapter, um, we are back at the Variety Theater, and this chapter takes kind of a horror spin. It's not so much comic macabre like earlier. This is more just straight up horror. And um, we're back in the Variety Theater with Rimsky, who's the financial director. And now that the show is over, he can't really make any sense of it because he's a naturalist and he just witnessed a whole bunch of supernatural occurrences. So when he looks out the window, he sees a whole bunch of women out there in their undergarments because if you recall, when they made that illusion of a shop, all the women were taking clothes. Once they put the clothes on and leave, then the clothes disappear, such as most of the gifts of the devil. So he feels the atmosphere in the office is changing and it's becoming more and more ominous. And he thinks about calling for help. But as soon as he does, the phone rings and then a very eerie, ominous, evil female voice on the other end says, um, don't do that, and basically threatens him. Then we finally get reintroduced to his old friend Villanuca, who comes through the door. He's now a vampire. So Villanuca then starts telling him a tale of Stiopa, and the tale kind of starts to get more and more absurd as it goes on, and it doesn't take long for Rimsky to realize that he's just lying. So then, when he realizes this, he sees a demonic naked woman floating outside the window, and she's trying to reach her arm through the vent and unlock the door. And her body shows signs of death and decay, like her skin is green, her arm is unnaturally flexible, and Velenuka also starts levitating, and Rimsky is terrified. And he notices that Velenuka isn't casting a shadow. His face is different. He's wearing a scarf around his neck to hide the bite marks. And he knows that his life is basically over, and he's aged by decades through this experience with the evil supernatural. So just when he's about to die, the rooster crows at dawn, and both of the villains fly out the window. Now, what's interesting is this scene begins at midnight and then ends at dawn. So this is kind of dipping into that surrealist genre that Bulgakov is writing in. So what's interesting about this is when you think about Peter's denial of Christ being paralleled by vampire folklore. So as the sun is coming up, the rooster crows and the demons disappear. Why? We can get into that in the discussion if we like. So chapter 15 rolls around, and now we are back in the clinic with Nicanor Ivanovich, and this is the same clinic that Ivan and the Master are also in. And Nicanor is very disturbed by apparitions of the demon Koroviev, and he is the only one who's seeing them right now. So he's almost like hallucinating seeing this demon, and this is the same demon that was leading the black magic show in chapter 12, I believe. So while he's spazzing out over these visions, the doctors don't know what to make of it, so they just inject him with a sedative. And he has a nightmare in which he is being accused of the same crime that he was arrested for, which is being in possession of foreign currency, except he's being accused on a stage in a very flamboyant and bombastic way. And this magnifies his guilt. So, just how the show in chapter 12 exposed a lot of people's sin, this is also exposing his, but it's making him feel ashamed of it, not so much to heal it or forgive it. So, Ivan also has a dream at the same time in this chapter, except his dream is about the setting sun over Ball Mountain, and this will be important in a second. So then that chapter is relatively short. Most of the chapter is just outlining the details of their dreams. Then chapter 16 comes around, and now, for the first time since chapter 2, we are transported back into first century Palestine, and we are with Yahshua, and he is being led to the cross on Bald Mountain, which is just another name for Golgotha or Calvary. So this chapter notes how many people are watching the execution happen. There is a parallel being drawn here to the spectacle in Moscow and the slaughter of innocents being a spectacle in this time period. Now, Matthew Levi, so the alleged apostle Matthew, is there, and he's watching and he's bitterly lamenting the entire scene. And he sees the torment of Yeshua and he wants it to end. And he even plotted a suicide mission to basically stab Christ in the back and then kill himself to end his misery. So Matthew then pleads to God after failing this, and he pleads that God will put Yeshua out of his misery. And since he doesn't, he ends up angry at God for allowing all of this suffering to happen. And he curses him and calls him a god of evil and a god of robbers. And as he does this, a storm ensues, which is a sign of God's presence. And we can get into how Bulgakov is using that to symbolize certain themes in the story that in discussion if we want. So then when we get to the actual crucifixion scene, we see the two criminals and Joshua. One is deranged, and the other, Dimas, which is interesting because we call him Saint Decimus, but Bulgakov calls him Dimas. I mean, there's a couple reasons why he might be doing this. Maybe one, he doesn't want to use his actual name because it would be too on the nose and getting canceled. Who knows? But there's the two thieves there, and Bulgakov actually does go into some pretty gross details here to make the scene very vivid and historical and believable, which is similar to what Ivan was criticized for in chapter one, making Joshua and Pontius Pilate too lifelike, because as we mentioned in the very first class, that's normally a very honorable virtue of a writer to be able to make something super lifelike. But in the Soviet Union, if you make a character like Christ and Pontius Pilate too lifelike, then you could be canceled for that. So then, then a hooded figure appears, and he'll be important later on in the book. And he tells a Roman soldier to raise the sponge up to Yahshua's lips for Yahshua to drink it. And Yahshua, in this version, this perspective of the gospel, Yahshua actually tells the soldier to give it to the thief on the cross instead. And this shows Yahshua's compassion for mankind and his willingness to put others before himself, which is one of the reasons why he says he's alone in the world in chapter 2. So his last words on the cross are also different from the Gospels, um, among tons of other things, but this will serve a narrative purpose later on down the road, so we don't have to get into that today. Now, after everyone leaves, Matthew takes the body down from the cross and leaves with it. So, yeah, so we can start our discussion now, and we can go over, we can do the analysis. So, well, I guess we start with chapter 14. So, now it should be noted that Bram Stoker's Dracula was translated into Russian in 1902.
Okay.
Um, but the copy that was known for being at the Library of St. Petersburg has been lost. So it is theoretically possible that Bulgakov would have read it because he did have access to Charles Dickens. So now the way he portrays the vampires, though, is a little bit different from what I've seen. Like he has them floating out of windows, he has
Yeah.
them being flexible and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's much more Eastern European. Actually, even when I found out the woman had the red hair, it was my first thought was, oh, she must be a Rusalki. That's why I asked you, but
Well,
I guess
that's
not.
Grigor we're known for having the red hair too.
Theoretically, yeah, there's also that. However, Russian vampires, it's a little bit difficult to get actual information on the Russians, weirdly enough. It's a little bit easier with the Romanians and the Hungarians, etc. But there's quite a lot of overlap when you get to sort of that area. Um, so her flexibility, for example, would be actually a fairly normal expression of a Strigoi ability. Stoker actually is one of the few actual Strigoi abilities to use, which is sort of the ability to sort of fit through any opening, no matter how narrow it is, right? Because this is the explanation for how Strigoi get out of their graves without disturbing the grave soil, right? As they kind of just sort of snake their way up out of it and then back in through some like little rat hole or whatever. And then the floating would be more indicative of a spirit. The one Russian vampire story that I can distinctly recall coming across indicates one a fear of running water, and this is before Stoker, so it has been something that they also had, which seems to be an something that spirits have trouble with, certainly in European folktales. The floating would indicate usually that, again, that he's not there. That's why he casts no shadow. You get in certain mythologies, of course, the lack of shadow as an indication it's a vampire, because again, it's the same thing. It's something of an illusion, not really a physical presence. So it's probably why he had the floating. I haven't myself come across stories with floating vampires that are fully human sized. Like you get little kind of will o' the wisp kind of deals, but I don't recall one that's like that size. The smacking of the lips thing that he's doing is very reminiscent of some Piro, which I believe come from Slovenia, where they're always making kind of kissy noises in anticipation of actually sucking your blood. It's one of the ways you can tell. So I'm assuming that's what he was actually referencing there with what is it, Valyunka?
Yeah, Valenuka, yeah. Well, it seems like
The
also.
cockcrow actually is definitely, and I don't know how far back that
Okay.
goes, whether it goes as far back as the Romans, who seem to be the sort of prototypical vampire originators for most of Europe. That's where we get the words trige, eventually Strigoi, so on and so forth. Um, but it is common for a lot of the vampire mythologies that they either have to be within their graves, either after the first cockcrow or by the third. I mean, it kind of depends on the region exactly how far. Obviously, he went with three. But they have to. So they hear the cocks crow, no matter how close they are, they disappear. They have to go back to doing whatever they do during the day. So
So in a way, so when they hear Rooster Crow, they basically go out of business.
yeah.
And is there any other specific reason why that might be?
Well, my again, this is why I'm not sure we got it from the Romans. I'm going to assume this is a version from Christianity, right? Obviously, because most of these region became Christianized at some point, and so you get some of the original mythology Christianized. My suspicion probably is that the Romans probably had something to do with the cock's crow, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
but it's mostly referencing sunlight as opposed to the,
Mm-hmm.
the reference to a biblical story. But obviously, when the Christians got a hold of it, they probably what they do, like let's say the third cock's crow, would be specifically for that reminiscence of Peter's denial,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that there's a very special moment that happens there.
But what do you think that is? Because at face value, that's an awful moment because Peter just finds out that he denied Christ 3 times and Christ was right about him, and then he spirals down into despair.
He does, but ultimately, when Christ resurrects, right, he has him reverse the denial. I would also argue, and even though it's a tragedy, let's say for Peter, in some way it's actually good for mankind. And in a different way, I mean, Jesus told him he was going to do it. So, and Peter is just, we know how he is as a disciple. He's the guy who can't wait to run in there and try everything, and maybe not so well, but he does want to, and he's very eager, but perhaps foolishly eager. And that this perhaps in some way you could argue maybe was good for him. I hesitate to go that far, but because unlike Judas, who did fall into total despair, that's why he killed himself. Peter didn't, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, he definitely was very despondent, but he still ended up interacting with the other disciples. He still ran to the tomb very early. He wasn't the first one, in the sense Mary Magdalene and everyone else there. But John comes to the tomb, Peter still runs into it. This is even after he's denied Christ, before Christ has come to him and has him do his reversal of his denial. So I might argue instead what that moment is for Peter is a revelation, actually, of the truth, because he remembers, right? Oh, that's right, I was told that I was going to do that, and I've just done this. So that could be maybe what they're kind of getting at
The
instead.
evil hates that.
Right, that perhaps what's happening here, you have because in some sense what you have with these vampires is they're the dead that walk, which they can't do. They're not supposed to. It's nothing about that is natural. And so perhaps what they're referencing there is, the cock crowing is not just the dawning here, but also the let's say the realization. Oh yes, this is all meant to be, or things supposed to be a certain way.
The scripture says Christ looked at him, or did he see Christ?
It depends. I think it's gospel. I think in Luke he looked at him, but in the other gospels they don't necessarily reference that.
Yeah, so it's that what caught my eye about that story was Christ's presence, his gaze, right there. Christ's gaze changes everything.
Right, and he looks at him, let's just say like, here we are.
It goes along the lines of revelation.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the notes that I had taken here is that this book starts out with a quote from Faust. The quote that I'm paraphrasing it, but it basically says, in reference to God, he who wills evil but forever does good. And the point of that quote is almost like God will use catastrophe to produce you catastrophe, to use some Tolkien-esque language.
Right.
And with the rooster crowing, and Peter, understanding what he did, seems like a bad thing on surface value, but in the long run, it's actually part of a grand story that results in the death of death.
Yeah.
And given that vampires are mostly a subverted fake resurrection, a subverted fake Eucharist, I can see why they run from that. It also says here too that the vampire's steps were completely silent.
Right, because he's kind of not physical, so that's the reason why he floats. Right, he doesn't weigh anything technically, even though he can interact with objects. And you see this in the Hungarian vampires because they're simultaneously incorporeal ghosts and also physically present. It's very odd how they get written about. So they're
They're kind of like semi-spirits.
sort of, yeah, because I mean, they can like basically just walk through a wall, for example, but they can also physically interact with you, like pick you up and things like that. But if you try to like stab them with a weapon, they'll just pass right through them. So it's a very strange form of physicality. And they also can just apparate, at whim. We don't see that obviously with Sugoi. Sugoi always physical and there, but this to me smacks more of the Hungarian flavor. So
Yeah, it's interesting too that he brings that up because it's like the vampire didn't walk through the door; he unlocked the door.
that's all we ever heard him do. We didn't, yeah, he didn't open it.
Well, yeah, but the other thing too is like given that the whole vampire trope is a subversion of Christ, yes, they can float and they're not really physical, they're like semi-spirits to use your language. But also when Christ rose from the dead, he could walk through walls too.
Yes, he could.
But as C.S. Lewis points out, it's not because he was some kind of spirit,
Right.
because that would be Gnosticism. It's because he was so physical and so tangible that everything else was
like
ghostly compared to him. Yeah.
Right.
Which is interesting too, because if you zoom in far enough on anything, everything's in motion. Like, nothing's really solid. So, yeah. And then I think we see some of that too in the Great Divorce, where the people in the lower parts of hell are like their feet are getting all cut up by grass and everything because they're just so intangible.
Right, and heaven is so real that it's like physically harmful to them. They can't pick up even an apple because it weighs too much.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind reminding me? So Veronica, he's the one that got beat up by the demons, right?
Yes, he's the one that got jumped.
And then I suppose it ends with him passing out when the girl demon, the redhead girl demon, is approaching him, right?
Yeah, she says, "Let me give you a kiss," and then
And so I guess the implication is that she turned him into a vampire.
yes,
Although it's very implied, and maybe they'll be more explicit about that later.
yeah. And right now they're just implying because he has like a scarf wrapped around his neck and
Yeah.
his
The lack of the shadow and the floating, I would say, is a much clearer indication. I mean, actually, it's a lack of shadow that keys off the financial director guy, actually, and that is the moment. And actually, even Valienko himself, when he realizes that's what he's seen, he just accepts. Okay, the cat's out of the bag. He knows. Let's just move forward with this. And that's what he's just doing with floating and everything else. It's like whatever. Everyone knows what I'm doing here.
So how does one become a vampire in these myths? Because if you get bit by a vampire, like sometimes you die, right? And sometimes you become one.
What I would say almost undoubtedly is a Stoker reference because throughout the folklore that I've come across, predation by vampires does not indicate there's no bite marks per se, or if there are bite marks, it's like on a corpse where like whole sections of the flesh have been devoured. In the case of Strigoi in particular, they usually are said to suck blood from the nose, right? You become weak, but it's because you almost can't breathe. In Hungary, the same idea, right, where they're crushing you and suffocating you, and they're sort of taking your life force. And blood, technically, but it's all kind of together, right, because the blood is the life. And so, in the case of Strigoi, or even I think in the Greeks, they do it this way, or you'll get bruising, because they can, everywhere they sort of suck blood from, it doesn't have to be your neck anywhere, it'll just leave a bruise behind, not puncture wounds, though. And that's why you get descriptions of like victims of vampires basically having, bruising all over their arms or their face or anything like that. So, but the fact that he has the scarf as the clue is a very Stoker-esque thing because it wasn't, I think, until Sheridan Lafanu.
How does it work in Stoker?
Well, in Stoker, who's almost undoubtedly referencing Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which is the first story that I'm aware of where it was a vampire biting the throat and there were puncture wounds. So they were very tiny, in the same way that Dracula's puncture wounds were actually quite small. They were like pinpricks. But regardless, in Stoker's version, a character who is actively being preyed upon by Dracula under his command actually intentionally covers her throat all the time for fear that people might see the pinpricks. And of course, the Victorians do, and they don't think anything of it until the vampire experience. Like, oh no! Those are, she didn't stab herself with the, brooch. Those are like, a vampire. And then over time, that's kind of become an exaggerated, giant, gory, like pencil holes in your throat kind of a deal. That's where we are now.
And
But
as far as I understand too, Stoker was the very first one to actually turn vampirism into a contagion. Whereas, like in prior folklore, it's like somebody became a vampire from demonic interactions, or they were born with some kind of weird defect or something. But
yes and no,
sure, you can
because
elaborate on
in the Greek and also it looks like in Poland and in Romania, there's definitely an aspect of vampirism being a disease
that.
that
Okay.
you can catch, and that you had epidemics of vampirism that would break out, and it was a whole issue. Um, and again, from looking at it, they probably were referencing an actual illness because it was from what's his name, Albert. I forget. There was a French commander in the 1700s. He went down to Greece to help, the Turks and everything else, and his men started to contract, quote, vampirism, unquote. So we have a fairly decent idea from him of sort of, let's say, from prime infection to death, where within the first 3 days of interacting with someone who has vampirism actively, you begin to have the shortness of breath, high fever, ruddy complexion, sometimes the blotching, right, the bruising as described elsewhere. And at that point, you might be dead within 2 weeks. I mean, it goes very quickly. Um, and you catch it by interacting with a quote vampire. In the polls, they actually reference another way you can catch it outside of interacting with somebody who actively has vampirism is if you eat an animal, for example, that a vampire has killed and preyed upon. That's actually a strictly forbidden thing to do. If you suspect that an animal you find was mauled by a vampire, don't eat it. In the case of not Arnold Pauli, I believe he was Serbian, there was a famous Polish outbreak, I think, in the late 1600s, where a particular individual, quote unquote, came down with vampirism. He died. His wife decided to try to hide that because there was a lot of shame involved, and my husband died of vampirism. And so she took him to the church to get him buried, regardless. And then her neighbors and other people around the city began to come down with vampirism, which is almost how they phrase it practically. Eventually, that was sort of put a stop to by people isolating, etc. And then another individual that they thought was actually her husband was spotted in the woods killing animals. And so there was a second outbreak actually when one of the people from the village found a slaughtered animal that they suspected maybe her first dead husband had, slaughtered. He ate it. Second outbreak of vampirism. At that point, everyone said, "Okay, we need to get to the bottom of this." They decided to, point blank ask her. So, did your husband die of vampirism? She goes, "Yeah." So they dig him up, and of course, he's, still. I mean, aside from being brilliant red, he is completely intact. They stake him, etc., and then they don't have any more outbreaks of vampirism afterwards. And one of the ways, by the way, you treat with vampires is not actually the staking per se; it's actually burning them completely to nothing, like no bones
Mhm.
left, absolutely nothing.
That would make perfect sense too, because I'm thinking of the vampire or the vampirism epidemic that happened in Greece in 1865.
Yep.
But it was different though. It wasn't like an actual disease. It was like demon possessed corpses. Like these things are walking around, and
Yeah, there's
they had to write specific instructions for the priests on how to deal with them. But one of them was that they told the people not to burn them because it's desecrating the body,
right.
and rather to use holy water, exorcisms, activists. That's
Right. Later ideas also of, someone who became vampire being excommunicated, then you sort of read rights over them. And
yeah. It was 6 years excommunication to burn a vampire.
yeah, and I have come across a couple of documents where priests were getting in trouble in Greece because they'd have people begging them to please let us stake this corpse, and him going, and the people going, "We're going to do it anyway," and him going, and being really caught between like ships the metropolitan and the lay people running around trying to put a stop to all this. It's kind of sad, actually. I mean, I'm laughing, but it's adorable.
Yeah. Um, well, we can get back to vampires, but we should get through at least chapters 15 and 16 first. Um, so chapter 15, pretty short. It's the two dreams. Anyone have any thoughts on that? About how Koroviev is just kind of psychologically messing with uh, Nicanor Ivanovich in the clinic. And then he gives him this dream where he's on trial, but it's like a theater. So it's like his sin that he didn't even do, by the way, was, at least as far as, unless I'm misremembering, but I don't think he was actually in possession of foreign currency. I think Voland, the devil, framed him. And then he got arrested for that and then went mad because he didn't actually do it. And now he's having a dream where he's being accused on a public stage. Um, so what I thought about that, I mean, I think I have here in my notes, that as he's arguing for his innocence in the clinic, he's crossing himself and he thinks that Koroviev is there because he's hallucinating and he sees him. And then he says to everybody, cleanse the place with holy water. And, um, and this is all coming from atheists. So,
But from a Christian background, in the sense that the culture,
kind
there
of,
would still be the leftovers.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that Bulgakov, I think, that he's trying to do here is even though he himself was raised Orthodox because he was, well into his adult years prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, he left his faith after his father died, and then I think he kind of got it back-ish as his life went on. But he was into some weird stuff in that in between time. He was going to seances, and he got addicted to morphine, and so, but that has been a theme in this book, which is the religious instinct that cannot be totally purged from people. Um, but yeah, it's this concept though of how, and this has been a tactic of the demons throughout this entire book. They put everyone's sins on display, but not so they can repent of them and get forgiveness and healing and all. They just put them on display to further drive that person into despair. And I think we're kind of seeing an example of that here. Um,
As an atheist until the demons show up,
yeah,
and
well,
then they're all crossing themselves and stuff.
begging for holy water. All right, so then the final chapter that we'll go over here, chapter 16. So we're in first century Palestine. Now, granted, this is basically the gospel from the devil's perspective. And one thing that I thought was interesting is when they go to offer Yeshua the sponge to drink from, he says, no, give it to the thief on the cross instead.
Confused me.
Yeah. Why? How come?
Well, you said in the car coming up here that it was from the devil's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out how that feeds him
Mm-hmm.
to show his compassion.
Yeah. Well, in chapter 2, he's basically saying that I'm alone in the world because I believe every human being is good. Um, and that's what Bulgakov is doing here. It's an extremely weird, nuanced view of evil because the
Hmm.
devil does some things that come off as good, but then downstream you find out it's bad. So,
I would love to, yeah, the downstream. What was significant that he took that particular scenario of the cross, twisted it. I mean, and of course, I'm sure this, I didn't read. I'm sitting here not having read,
most people
but
have.
having had listened to some. But what was significant, I know there's a relic of the Father Hector just told us about. There's a relic of the sponge.
It might, what it might actually be, and I could be wrong. You guys can let me know. This is actually one of the conceits of communism, right? Which is that we're going to do Christ better than Christ did, right? On Earth. So it could be the devil saying, well, see, in your story, he didn't do this, but in my story, he was even better. It could be that kind of subversion.
Like weaponized compassion.
Yeah. So that could be what's being portrayed here. And he's going, haha, do you really have the right story? Because, surely your Christ would have done this, or something like that.
Because it also invokes a little bit of pride to say, no, I'm fine.
That's a good observation. Yeah.
I think that the gospel that Jesus is preaching in the first appearance in Judea is also weird, like that everyone's a good man. Like that's not at all, what Christ
Yep.
said. I mean, I think if you everyone has the potential, everyone's born in the image of God, but Christ does preach judgment, right? That there's the broad road leading to destruction, the narrow way good. So like this Christ is like better than our Christ because he likes everyone. He thinks everyone's good, whereas our Christ is all like judgy and stuff. Like isn't this a better Christ?
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really good point too, because that is exactly what I mean. Not just the Bolsheviks, but almost any oppressive regime kind of likes to rewrite history in their favor. And I'm also thinking too how when that person comes to Christ and he says, good teacher, and Christ says, why do you call me good? None is good but God. So perhaps he's trying to directly contradict what he already said. The other interesting thing too about this is Matthew is taking notes on Christ's ministry during this whole time, and in chapter 2, Christ said that Matthew sometimes misrepresents him in his writings. So it's almost like he's trying to.
Yeah, don't look at those gospel stuff. Those are wrong.
Well, you always get people I have atheist friends who always like to bring up, like, well, all these non-canonized books, and clearly they don't go along with the Bible. So clearly the Bible is wrong, which is just okay. I mean, but it is
It's a very
that.
special kind of argument.
It is, the mindset that you sometimes fall into if you're trying to make sure that, the Christians are wrong, I suppose. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting how, in a way, one thing that we have been seeing with this is kind of like a bit of an inception point, I guess, because there's a few layers to it. But um, in the chapter where we meet the master, who is kind of the author's writing, and he says, um, he says, yeah, I burned this book that was about Pontius Pilate because there's no way I could get it published and all that. And of course, that's exactly what Bulgakov did. But what's interesting is this book is that book, and this book exists in a similar way in chapter two when Berlioz is criticizing Avant for his poem on Pontius Pilate, and Christ saying, "You're making them seem too real. You're making them seem too historical. You're not supposed to do that because we're not even supposed to be writing about this to begin with." And then Bulgakov goes way out of his way in this chapter to describe all the nitty-gritty graphic details of the crucifixion to make it seem as lifelike as humanly possible. So it's almost like he knows the rules and he's deliberately breaking them as he's writing this story.
And this book was, I think we mentioned before, was published after his death, right?
Yeah, it wasn't published until I think there was an abridged version in the '60s under Khrushchev, and then I don't think the unabridged version came out until like '73 or something.
good old Mickey.
Yeah.
So if you, it's just a very self-aware book.
Yes. Yes, very much so. I mean, part of it is very much political satire, surrealism, and we're seeing a lot of that too. There's two dreams in the same story. Now, what's interesting is in chapter 15 when um, Yvonne has that dream of the sun setting over Bald Mountain, and then we're transported back into first century Palestine where Christ is being crucified on Golgotha, which in this book is Bald Mountain. Um, it's almost like he has some kind of mystical connection to this story, hence the reason he was trying to publish a paper about it. And him and the master seem to have had that same mystical connection with the story of history here. And I think that's going to get fleshed out later. But
By the way,
yes.
if there's being a direct, let's say, attempt to liken Bald Mountain to Golgotha, you're aware of Bald Mountain and its reputation, right? As
By all means,
like
tell
a
us.
nexus of witches and like extremely dark gods and worship and everything else. So I could also see, if this is all from the devil's perspective, is he's literally in some sense actually trying to overlay like Bald Mountain on top of Golgotha, right? So he can portray all of this. So that might be what's underlying that, because it'd almost be like likening, like the Church of Satan, right? With it's like any Orthodox church, they're not. Even if you want to say, well, they're both hills or something, or they're both churches. So that could be the additional dimension, and that what you're almost being told, actually, you're about to see the upside down version of it because we're starting. If you know it's Bald Mountain, like this is not the original. You're being shown the Witch Haven version of the story. So
The vampires hang out there too.
yeah, demons, all kinds of things. It's
Where's Bald Mountain?
I believe it's in Russia. I couldn't tell you where. And I believe Chernobog is actually a deity of that area, or at least that mountain.
And were there okay, so we've gone through all three chapters. Were there um, any other thoughts, and any other inquiries, comments about these chapters specifically? I think these chapters do a good job of like encapsulating the author's talent. It's how he's able to switch genres the way he does. I appreciated that. I did actually have an additional note on chapter 14, if you want to go back there, which is Bulgakov seems to be writing the biological view of sin in here. And what I mean by that, and I don't know why scholars call it that, but they do, it's that view of sin that is present in the Old Testament that the Hebrews believed in, which is mostly that sin kind of leaves a taint on everything that it touches. And when these vampires are approaching the room, the atmosphere changes,
Yep.
everything gets more eerie, things get cold,
Very
Right.
Hungarian vibe.
Yeah, like
There's like a dank smell in the room, right?
Yeah.
yeah, and like when the window opens, instead of like the smell of the fresh outside coming in, it's just like death. Partially because there's a dead woman out there, but I mean that was palpable, before he noticed they were there. Um, that's the normal thing with vampires. Do vampires normally behave like that in terms of like
It
they
depends.
change the atmosphere wherever they go?
It depends. Like that's why some of them it just like the breath, right, is actually especially in the Hungarian version, disease causing inducing, like even breathing the breath that they exude, which smells like, a rotted corpse, can cause you to basically become ill and die, even if they don't prey on you. And that they themselves also are cold. So the Hungarian ones are very more poltergeist-esque in the sense that they also they will like move furniture and make noises, and sometimes while not being visible. So again, that's where it's kind of overlap in their sense with a completely spirit ghost as opposed to like a 100% physical as Tinigoi, corpse. And I think I was trying to mention with the Russian one that I came across where he can't cross water, and that vampire never appeared in person to anybody. Like he was inside the carriage supposedly that was coming to catch his bride, but couldn't cross water. So again, the question is, to what degree was he inside the carriage, right? Or was it a quote real carriage or not? Because I think the carriage itself casts no shadow, which would indicate that it itself is also a phantasm.
Hmm.
Like I said, it's the only Russian word I've ever come across within the upir. It's the Russian word.
Do you think it would be safe to assume that in a lot of these Russian stories, when they mention these creatures, they're kind of default accepting the Romanian version of the Hungarian version?
Yeah, but also Russia is a very large country with a lot of different ethnic groups. So I could easily see they've got immigrants from all over the world, all over the place, and they all bring their own versions of these stories, and you hear an amalgam of them. And that might be why I'm having a hard time pinning down like the specifically Russian flavor of vampire, as opposed to like say the Vidrkulaks, the Greeks, or whatever else. So who knows?
Oh, it makes sense that spirits can't cross water because like moving bodies of water are like barriers to the land of the dead, right? It's like the river Styx
Yeah, it's a relatively common. It's certainly in European folklore. I haven't that I recall come across it in non-European folklore, but I am not like a full expert, so all it would take is me finding one somewhere and then, oh, there it is.
What's interesting too is it also says that when he was starting to experience this, the lamp on his desk was fading.
Yeah, the Hungarian story that I came across actually, the vampire could actually affect candles and like could put them out just by showing up, and also that could breathe fire, which this guy didn't do, so he's not totally, yeah. Um, But I think in the Hungarian one actually it also the vampire presence made the candles glow blue as well, which I noticed that he was trying to hide from the blue light of the lamp. And again, is the lamp always blue or did it become blue as a result of the vampire's presence? I don't know. Like, Spring Heel Jack from the British they called Penny Dreadfuls, also breathed blue fire. That was one of the indicators that he was a supernatural monster.
That's so interesting too, because the holy fire in Jerusalem is blue when it first appears, and then like over the course of 10, 15 minutes, it turns into regular fire. So it's like another subversion.
Could be.
Yeah, very interesting. Any additional thoughts on that before I wrap this up?
Not that I can distinctly recall. It is interesting that he is, of course, incredibly pallid. I don't recall that being a detail that I've seen in anything outside of English interpretations of vampires. I would say the Strigoi, generally speaking, are either just completely corpse-like, or else they are brilliant red, or else they have the blotches and things on them. I don't recall the Hungarians being described as pale or the Upi or anything else. It just seems to be the Brits who are very focused on them having a gray or a dead pallor. But you see, not just Brits, I guess also Iceland, kind of like Northern Europe.
Mm.
Perhaps they are just used to looking really great on a die. So
Well, it says Rimsky was basically aged for like decades.
right, which is not something that I recall coming across elsewhere, but you could easily see that as a subversion of the general vampire story. In this case, obviously, just being in contact with them, they were sort of sucking out his life force. This would be more the Hungarian take, right? In this case, it resulted in aging as opposed to weakness or a loss of blood or something like that. It's a loss of vitality if you want to look at it that way.
Hmm. Okay, I guess that makes perfect sense. Um, they do the opposite of give life. So,
Question about will.
Mhm.
And the reason what's spurring it is in the story that we listened to on the car on the way here. He locked the door, the vampire locked the door,
Mhm.
almost as if he was under the will of the spirit, the demon, I'll call her demon, that was out of the window.
Yes.
So, what kind of will do they have? Or don't they have, or are they completely subject?
Well, and this might be another kind of Stoker influence, for example, because generally speaking, in mostly the traditional folklores, vampires do not work in tandem with each other. They're all completely independent, individual monsters. Even when you have an epidemic, they're all just on their own, like zombies doing their own thing.
Not in community.
Right. Stoker, and I think this actually is the thing that Stoker did invent, was not just a community of vampires, but a hierarchy of vampires, right? With Dracula at the top and all his various minions. And they're all weaker as they go down the ranks also. So, he has all of the power, and then his wife and daughters, I insist that he does not have 3 brides, have their own abilities. And then you have, like, Lucy down here and so forth. Renfield's, who knows what's going on with that. So that could be a potential Stoker influence.
Well, it does say that she had like these ugly spots on her chest.
Well, that could be a Strigoi influence, but this might be just a literal sort of coming together of everything into one W.
Okay. Well, any other closing thoughts, Hannah? Israel? Owen?
Cowboy. We've exhausted them.
Okay. Well, in that case, we'll say our prayer to Panagia, and then we can continue to talk or leave or whatever. Right, how would you say the prayer once this time?
Right.
Let us be the regular one. It is truly meet to bless you that they have taught us they are blessed and blameless in the mother of our God. More honorable in the chair from the younger from more glorious in the Sarah from you who without corruption give birth to God's word. No truth there help us to magnify you. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Okay, thank you for coming, everybody.
Well, actually, I was going to say, I don't know if we have any expertise on corsets, because corsets came up last night, I think.
Yeah, briefly.
So I don't know if you've actually ever worn me, in which
Yes.
case you can
Oh.
maybe
Yes.
give us a
Comfortable.
Yeah.
Bras are terrible.
Yeah.
I don't know.